Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, this is Orphan Last, aka Skylar Madison, and today I'm going to continue drawing this Babylon 5 fan art piece that I started to work on last week. Now, I apologize about last week's video, as it was an unedited, real-time piece of crap video, but I really didn't have many options at the time, so again, I am sorry. So, the first thing that I tackle inside of this video that you're watching right now is the front spherical portion of Babylon 5's structure. Now, I've said it before, and I'll say it again, whenever you're drawing, you want to start with the most basic shapes. And when you're drawing in perspective, you're drawing squares and boxes. So I draw out a red square to represent the back of the spherical section of the front portion of Babylon 5. Now, in order to find a sphere in perspective, there's a few really official ways of going about it, but it can be fairly convoluted. Now, it may not seem like it's an intimidating thing, but you're trying to draw a perfect circle that resides perfectly inside of a box. And this is more than just drawing an ellipse inside of that box. I mean, an ellipse would be something that's more so a circle that's drawn out on one of the faces of the box. And if you draw a circle on just any given side of the box, you're not going to be coming up with anything that resembles a sphere inside of that box. And it is an important thing to at least have a rough idea as to where and how big that sphere, that circle, needs to be inside of that box. Otherwise, all of the other parts of the space station just won't align correctly to that spherical section. So although I tend to be fairly loose with my method of finding a sphere within a 3D sort of box, the general idea is that you find the center going all the way around one of the hemispheres of the box. Those centers can help you roughly draw out an ellipse that represents the horizontal hemisphere of the sphere. Then you draw out a bunch of X's going around the perpendicular or vertical portion of the previous hemisphere that you drew out. And the general idea is that you find your vertical hemisphere, and the new centers that you will find will help you to draw another ellipse. And when you're done, you wind up with these two ellipses, one horizontal, one vertical. And the general idea is that you have the height and the width of the sphere. So I tend to eyeball the rest in order to form the sphere based off of those hemispheres that you draw out, or at least what you see me doing on the screen. And I adjust whatever just doesn't quite look right. I'm the artist, the math involved is supposed to service me, not the other way around. If you want to be the sort of artist that depends 100% on the math and have absolutely no artistic intuition or anything like that, I'll go ahead and leave you to do that. But for me, I try to play it a little bit loose while still trying to understand the math to some extent. The next step that I decided to tackle was the neck of the spherical section of Babylon 5. Now, there was a ton of math involved in doing this little section, and in the end, eventually you'll see it on the screen, I wound up looking at it and eventually decided just to delete it because I didn't really like the way it looked. And then I wound up sifting things around a bit with the lasso tool and clicking and dragging. But I didn't take that decision lightly. Anytime that you use the lasso tool inside of perspective and adjust things, moving things around, I have to look over each and every little piece of what I just moved in order to make sure that things either do or don't need to be adjusted in order to fit the position in perspective. Now, when I draw with pencil and paper, it is helpful to draw with a multicolored, non-reflective pencil of some sort, or multiple non-reflective pencils. And I do exactly that with my pencil drawings, with pencil and paper. But since I don't do it very often with pencil and paper, the colored pencils that I tend to use really aren't necessarily art supplies, as much as they are actually intended to be a highlighter for taking notes in college notebooks, that sort of thing. It's a multicolored mechanical pencil made by Pentel, and I get them off of Amazon for something like $15. They're pretty expensive, but they last freaking forever. The lines tend to be a little bit difficult to erase, but like I said, they aren't intended to be art supplies, but that's just how I use them. And since I don't draw on pencil and paper very often, I don't really care too much if I can't erase them 100%. And they're non-reflective, so I don't really care. I just find it a little bit frustrating that people don't make a mechanical, non-reflective, multicolored coloring pencil as an art supply. So, to my knowledge, this is the only product that I've ever found, at least, that has some of what I'm looking for on that regard. It's just one mechanical pencil with 8 different colors in it, which is awesome. So Babylon 5 is pretty much just a series of ellipses, and ellipses are one of the least favorite things to draw for me. In this video, you'll see me kind of do a shorthand process of making each ellipse, meaning that I use a process that takes a few less lines in order to draw an ellipse, and it takes a little bit more artistic intuition, but that doesn't mean that it makes it too much faster necessarily. It's just slightly faster. It still takes forever to draw each ellipse.
So why would you draw all of your ellipses this way or any way if it takes longer to do it that way?
Because you don't want to have issues with your ellipses. If you don't draw your ellipses at least with a little bit of care, you can wind up making your image look otherworldly and consisting of a ton of multiple perspectives that just look wrong. If you recall my two-parter video series called Critique and Redraw,
there's a card in the upper right corner of the screen right now.
You'll remember how in that image that I critiqued, there were all these ellipses and none of them seemed to align properly in accordance to what your camera angle was, at least while viewing it. The image just didn't seem to make sense as to how you were positioned in the scene. When you draw out your ellipses with the rules that I've shown you, or even in the way that I draw inside of this video, you're making sure when you draw your ellipses this way that all of your ellipses align with your vanishing points correctly. And when you're drawing your ellipses to align correctly with your vanishing points, what you're doing is you're making sure that your ellipses are going to look the way they need to look for your camera angle. Now you'll notice that the next part of Babylon 5 is where the cylinder that pretty much makes up Babylon 5's entirety forms a little bit into a bevel. Now there is some truth to what some artists say. Sometimes the most rigid images that just look wrong are the high construction images. If you rely 100% on all of these construction lines and such, sometimes the image just won't come out the way you want, and sometimes the image will come out rigid and not come out the way that you want it. So I didn't really measure the bevel out all the way around to make sure each side of that bevel is perfectly measured. I've tried measuring it out perfectly in the past, and it just didn't seem to work out for me. And from past experience, I know that at this stage it's time to use a little bit of artist's intuition. Now, although I've been erasing a bunch of my construction lines as I go, this is just so that I can make sure that I understand what the heck I'm looking at, what I'm working on at any given point in time. But if I need to redraw old construction lines, which I do actually somewhat frequently, I still have my blocking out sketch that I drew out in the previous video in this series. Now, that blocking out sketch can change in the process of drawing the picture, especially if it's to make the image fit the proportions more accurately. But once I have that blocking out sketch exactly the way that I want it for what I'm drawing, I never erase the blocking out sketch. And this makes it so that if I need to go back and redraw construction lines, I have the blocking out sketch to go by. The blocking out sketch is a little bit like a foundation. I still have the foundation of the drawing following me around throughout the entire process of drawing the drawing. The blocking out sketch is extremely useful if you need to backtrack on something. Nothing is worse than losing your equilibrium on a piece that you're drawing out and never being able to finish it because you're not sure what you have to do in order to find out where you are in the image in this 3D space on the page. The blocked out sketch makes sure that you never have to abandon a project like that. So that's why I'm using it. That's why I spent so much time in the last video looking at it. It's not necessarily a horrible thing that last week's video was as long as it was, or that it was as low quality as it was. It is a little bit of an emphasis on how important the blocking sketch is in the process of making an image like this, where there's a lot of things going on. And there's another beveled section here again, and there was more intuition than measuring yet again. And I got further and further away from the camera, and as I got further and further away from the camera and closer to the vanishing point with Babylon 5, the shape of the cylinder eventually got rather tall. It wound up not really quite looking right. And you see me drawing out some rather tall rectangles. Now, maybe I might be able to clean that up a bit when I ink the image with vectors, or maybe I'll just leave it as it is. To me, Babylon 5 still looks like Babylon 5, regardless of if things started to kind of lose their proportion a little bit and the ellipses kind of get a little bit elongated a little bit. It still looks like Babylon 5 to me. So maybe I'll adjust it, maybe I won't. The closer you get to a vanishing point, the less and less critical it is to make sure that your details are necessarily perfect. I know that there's still dust particles in space, but I'm not entirely sure if there's necessarily atmospheric disturbance. Does that still exist inside of space? That's a thought. I don't know. But regardless, as things get further and further off into the distance, details are getting smaller and smaller and smaller to the point to where you don't need to draw them nearly as much. And so, measuring things out when they're just a few pixels tall, it's not necessarily the highest critical point where you need to draw out all of these construction lines. That's not really even going to be possible. So, I don't know. That's kind of some food for thought. And so, if things aren't absolutely perfect when it gets so far out there, it doesn't quite matter as much. So, you basically see me freehand the last little tail end of Babylon 5 next to the vanishing point. And now that I'm looking at it right now, maybe that last little tail end needs to kind of shrink down a little bit more. As things get that close to the vanishing point, maybe they need to get significantly smaller. Yeah, that needs to be adjusted. So then I start working on the solar panels, at least a little bit. I do a number of measurements in order to make sure they're right, but I go back to working on the solar panels eventually. Then I go to work on the CNC section and begin working on the spine and fork to Babylon 5. You'll see me have a little bit of a false start with the spine and fork, and that's primarily because I looked at the neck section of Babylon 5 right next to the spherical section. I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, and hated what I saw. So I got rid of the neck at this point and moved the sphere into alignment. And if I kept all of those construction lines for the fork, I knew that I might as well start all the way over again anyways, because I wouldn't wind up aligning properly with the red and blue vanishing points. It's okay to start over with a bit of construction work, especially if you got the math wrong or if things needed to be adjusted. The reason is because at each attempt you have a working prototype that's either getting better and better in theory, or at least more and more simplistic, less and less convoluted, more accurate each time. And these sorts of approaches, whether you're simplifying or getting it more accurate or both, these are good things whenever you have to do a second or third step or attempt at doing something. There are some details to the spine of Babylon 5 that I left out that exist inside of my reference, and there's a number of reasons why. The first reason is because I really didn't think that my reference image was actually TV accurate. I don't think that image, the reference image, came from the TV show at all. I think that it was a fan-made, fan art piece of creation where someone took a little bit of creative liberties with the design of Babylon 5, and you know what, they did a really good job. I really like it, but I don't think it's necessary. I've recently rewatched Babylon 5, and there's some details on that spine inside of my reference that I've never seen inside of the TV show. This isn't my first time drawing Babylon 5, so I consider myself a little bit familiar with how Babylon 5 looks, and even if Babylon 5 did have all of those details at one point in the TV show, everything I drew in this image already communicates to all the fans of Babylon 5 that they're looking at Babylon 5 without the extra struggle of figuring out all of the little tiny mathematical details to all of these tiny little parts on Babylon 5's spine. So it didn't really matter in the end. It wouldn't really be a big quality jump. So I left some of those details out. Now it's time to move on to working on the Excalibur ship. Now, I first got my reference image and started to draw out the bulge of the massive cannon on the front that renders the ship inoperable for 60 seconds when that cannon is used. At least I think it was 60 seconds. Was it 30 seconds? I'm not quite sure. It's been a while since I last saw Excalibur. You can actually see me drawing out all of these carefully drawn out construction lines for a rather long time, only for me to start to erase all of that construction work for the front cannon. My second stab at the frontal cannon was a much more simplistic approach, and sometimes the most simplistic approach is the best approach. Not every time, but sometimes. I tend to overcomplicate things when I draw, but only because I'm trying to understand what I'm looking at. And there was just one tiny bit of logic to my first attempt that just didn't work. It wasn't centered properly. It was the first square that I drew out. If you can go back and actually find out what it is that I was doing wrong,
you'll get a rhetorical cookie.
If I had just done one more extra step in drawing out all of the construction, then everything would have just been fine. But it occurred to me that regardless of if I was hyper accurate with the math or not, the end result would generally wind up looking the exact same way. There wouldn't be a dramatic quality jump if the math was perfect when compared to just using it a little bit of artistic intuition. So I went the route of artistic intuition. Now, pay attention to how often I keep going back to my reference to make sure that I understand the reference. While drawing the Excalibur, there were times where I'd have parts of it nearly fully drawn out, only to start all the way over again on that whole section just because I wasn't happy with my comparison to what I've drawn to what's inside of the reference image. If you are able to understand your reference well enough the first time, you won't have to redo a bunch of work. But we're not computers. We're not entirely conscious beings. Consciousness is basically the state of being awake, okay? Otherwise, if we were fully conscious beings, fully awake, our first drawing that we ever draw would wind up coming out as photorealistic masterpieces every time. And we'd be able to recall just how many bricks we've seen in our entire life, how many buildings we've seen them on, how many bricks were on each building individually on average, and how many bricks are most probably on each building on the sides that you never saw. And you'd be able to do all of this with instantaneous recollection if we were fully conscious and aware. I kind of feel like people these days have way too much hubris in thinking that we know everything, or at least that we're the smartest things in the universe. But if we can't even recall these sorts of details, even after studying one image for hours and hours, then it kind of gets you to think, how much of reality are we actually taking in, and how much of it is just passing us by. Now, not only that, if you're not able to draw a fairly accurate image with a reference, regardless of what stage, how can you say you really understand much of anything about reality? I really think that artwork really shows the humble side of the human condition. It shows us just how much, or at least how little, we actually understand about what we see. And so you'll see me drawing out tons of measurements only to erase them again over and over again, because everyone suffers from a lack of consciousness. Seriously, how awake can we be if we repeat the same mistakes over and over again, forget things, can't recall details, can't eyeball measurements with exact precision, can't eyeball what's level and plumb, suffer from recovered memory?
Which is to say, where we remember things that never actually happened to us.
And the list just goes on and on and on and on. We only have 5 senses and an 8-pound brain. In some ways, we're like the Beetle trying to understand and reverse engineer the universe. It kind of seems like an impossible task. And then you see me draw out the cylinder of the ship, and after that was this weird V-shaped portion that ends in this sharp point at the bottom of the Excalibur cylindrical section. The only thing that I don't really like about the Excalibur is that it's said to be a combination between Earth and Minbari technology, yet Minbari ships seem to resemble aquatic geometry like stingrays, jellyfish, things like that, and Earth ships seem to always be this blocky industrial looking thing. The artificial gravity sections were like these rotating sort of things that just the next version of steampunk for the children of the future. And EarthGov ships seem to always have that, but with the Excalibur, it has nothing that resembles the Earth's industrial look that's kind of inherent inside of Babylon 5, and it didn't even have the aquatic look that Minbari ships have inside of the Babylon 5 universe. Don't get me wrong, I like the design of the ship, but the design is neither Earth-related nor Minbari-related. How is this a combination of the two? That's what I don't like about the design of the Excalibur ship. Next, you see me find the center of mass for the wings in order to form the V-shaped portion underneath the Excalibur. In the end, I kind of don't think that the math added up there, but I made it work. Then there's this cylindrical bit that comes to a point on the top of the cylindrical section of the Excalibur. Then there's the top wing. You'll see me work hard on this upper wing, only for me to later see problems with some of the construction of the aft portion of the ship. So eventually I wind up erasing that wing and reworking some of the blocking sketch to make sure that it works with what I have drawn out. I realized that the top wing also was a little bit taller than all of the diagonal wings, a little bit longer. So that is some of the reason as well as to why I reworked some of the blocking sketch for the Excalibur. The other reason why I decided to rework some of the blocking sketches because I saw how some of that V-shaped bit, some of the sections that I had already drawn actually continued further aft, further towards the back of the ship than the wings did. And so I needed to make that big box at the back that represent the wings, I needed to make sure that that blocking sketch moved a little bit closer to us and changed shape a little bit. Now you can see as I draw these propulsion engines at the tip of every wing, I'm careful to draw lines out in order to try and just make sure that there's some sort of relationship, that they look like they start and end at the same length. That sort of thing. Then there's the Agamemnon. This is when I draw the EarthGov ship. This is where I adjust nearly everything with the blocking sketch. Even when I was making last week's video, I knew that there were problems with this blocking sketch with this EarthGov ship. I even took several stabs at changing the blocking sketch in this video that you're watching right now while fleshing this thing out. And that's fine. Fixing things is never a bad thing. I included the EarthGov insignia on the bow of the Earth Cruiser as well, which I thought was a nice little touch. There's also a little A on that section as well, kind of on the bottom. The rotating artificial gravity bit of the ship, ultimately the diagonal rectangle was free-handed, but the rest of it still goes towards the blue vanishing point, just like every other portion of this ship. Something like this can really throw a newbie off balance. And I suppose there might be more technical means in order to draw a diagonal bit to the ship, but who gives a crap? Sometimes you need to remember the KISS acronym. Keep it simple, stupid, which is something that I tell myself pretty often. You see me adjust the bow of the ship, and I quickly police little pieces to make sure that the perspective was correct. In the end, since it was free-handed, there's a little bit of wiggle room. Not much was needed to be adjusted. The rest of the Earth Cruiser was kind of covered up by the rotating crew quarters, or at least I'm assuming that they're crew quarters on that rotating artificial gravity bit. So I quickly just free-handed a little bit of the port section of the ship, and before I knew it, I was done with the Earth Cruiser. Sometimes there's saving graces to having foreshortening and perspective in general in your image. Sometimes objects overlap over other objects, which means less drawing. While other times, if it's really close to the camera, you still need to do a lot of measuring things out, but you only need to actually draw out very little. Either way, sometimes it means less work. Then I decided to tackle the jump gate. I started working on a nice solid construction to the jump gate, but like I said in last week's video, I have family that came down to visit and I only have time to work up to this point. Hopefully you guys are finding this to be educational or at the very least interesting. So here's the final image for at least the week. It's not finished or anything. As you can see, I'm still working through it. It's still at the messy stage. I hear a bunch of newbie artists mention the messy stage and make it out to seem like some sort of excuse why things aren't constructed properly, but the whole point of the messy stage is to work into making something more and more formal. I started out with square boxes and I finish the messy stage with a sound, mathematically convincing image. Yes, there's artistic intuition, but there's a bunch of lineal geometry happening that is, at least to some degree, accurate. And I think it's coming together pretty well. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to get more notifications from me, feel free to click on the bell or go ahead and follow me on Twitter. A link is supplied in the video description below. If you'd like to support my channel, there's an end screen card on the screen right now to do so. It'd be much appreciated. Or if you'd like to, feel free to click on any of the other end screen cards to see more of my content. That'd be much appreciated as well. Thank you very much for your time.